Moses, and if you've been to these events before, you'll probably recognise me as the resident photographer. But I do have the pleasure of welcoming you this evening. This is the 12th event in the Imagine2027 series. And if my voice falters, please excuse me because I've had a sore throat this week, but I'm trying to project. So some of you will be new, and so I'd like to take an opportunity of explaining to you a little bit about this series. It's a particular project, Imagine2027, of the Cambridge Commons, and we're presenting this in collaboration with a Labour history group at Aon Hewitt. We have a website, and if you care to look up Imagine2027, then you will get links to all the previous recordings that we've made of the other 11, and you'll have details of the events to come. So this evening we are going to be talking about housing, and people like talking about housing in Cambridge. Our city, our country, and indeed we can say our entire planetary system is at a deeply challenging time, with record inequalities in income, wealth, resources, opportunities, with billions of people live in poverty, famine, drought and injustice, and where millions face violence and war on a daily basis. We know that the problems are local, national, global and systemic. There is no one thing that is going to change it all. And yet we are bold enough in the Cambridge Commons to ask ourselves, what can we do from our own small lives here to bring about change in Cambridge and beyond? In running this programme, we've invited people who are eminent in their fields to give us a deeper understanding of the issues we face in finding solutions. People who not only have specific knowledge of them or particular perspectives, but who also have a broad sense of the socio-economic issues that drive these inequalities. They are here to help us join up the dots and help us think about how we can contribute to make the world safer and more equal for us and our fellow human beings. To do that, we need collective analysis, collective understanding, and collective action. And Imagine2027 and the Cambridge Commons do have partner organisations like Changing Conversations and Cambridge Conversations, where we can and you can join us in discussing these issues further, because there is only limited time in a Q&A and only a few voices get heard. So I've got a few housekeeping things to try and remember as well. Fire alarm. If the fire alarm goes off, there is a fire. So there's a door here and a door there. Wi-Fi and hashtag are here. So do tweet. And if you're into writing blogs, do get in touch with us, because we'd like to put your blog onto our website. We're going to be recording this evening, and I'm going to be back at my usual job of taking photographs soon. So if you have any objections to that, then please let the people in charge know, and we may be able to buzz your face if you happen to get in it. For the Q&A, there will be mics circulating. So I am now going to introduce you to David Howard, who is also an eminent man. He is a professor here at Cambridge, in exactly what?
Law and public policy.
Law and public policy, having been a councillor for 15 years and an MP for 5 years. And he is going to introduce our guest speaker to you.
Thanks, Linda. So I used to be somebody. Our speaker tonight is Laurie MacFarlane, who is another economist. I apologise for yet another economist, but they do sometimes know some stuff. And Laurie is certainly one of the ones who does know some stuff. He is based in Edinburgh and is currently the economics editor of Open Democracy website, very interesting website which you should look at if you don't know it. And he's an associate fellow of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London, which is an exciting new venture of UCL. Prior to that, Laurie was at the New Economics Foundation, where he was a senior economist. And before that, he worked largely in government. We won't go into what he worked on, but it's mainly about water. So any questions about water, please pick up. And also in think tanks, including the Commonweal think tank in Scotland. He's going to be talking about housing, as Lena said. And he's the co-author of this fantastic book, Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing, with Josh Ryan Collins and Toby Law. And as the back of the book says, this is a lucid exploration of the dysfunctional British housing market. And that's praise from the Financial Times, which is on one side. On the other side, just to join up the dots of our own series, it's praised in these terms: lucid and convincing, economics is evolving, and this crucial book is a key part of its transformation. And that's a comment by Danny Dahl, who many of you will see right at the start of this series. So the series is now starting to loop in on itself, but to get denser and more interesting, and Laurie is part of that. So over to you, Laurie.
Thanks very much. Thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks for having me here in Cambridge. It's great to have an opportunity, I think, to speak at an event which is about a positive vision of the future. I think too often we're mulling over the current problems that we have, and I'll be honest up front, I am going to do a bit of that, but certainly we're hopefully going to get to a point about putting forward about a more positive vision. I should start by saying, you may have noticed, some of you, that the event was originally billed as being a joint event with my partner in crime, co-author Toby Lloyd, who was head of policy at Shelter. Unfortunately, the time between agreeing to do the event and today, Toby was poached by Theresa May to be her new housing advisor in Number 10 Policy Unit, so he had to pull out of all engagements. Which I think is a reasonable excuse, but I can't guarantee that everything that we're going to go through tonight is going to somehow translate into government policy, because I think that'd be somewhat wishful thinking. I want to kick off by just posing a question, and that question is, why is it that despite the vast increases in wealth and amazing advances in technology that we've seen over the past half century, that one of our most basic needs, which is shelter, has for many people become a greater burden on the means than ever before? The UK is not alone among advanced economies today in facing a severe housing affordability crisis. Average house prices in England are now 9 times higher than average incomes. Many parts of the country it's much higher than that, particularly down this part of the world, in London and the southeast. A whole generation finds itself priced out of the market, struggling to make ends meet in the private rented market. And homelessness is now rising rapidly, and has been for a number of years. The question is, how did we get here? The common explanation that you often hear by politicians or in the media, or even indeed some economists, is that we're just not building enough homes. And that the answer, therefore, is we just need to be building more homes, and that's the solution. And what our view is, and the view that we outline in the book, is that this is certainly part of the picture, but it's far from the whole story. And what I'm going to do in the first part of the talk is unpick that story a little bit deeper to find out what's really going on. This chart here shows the value of the UK housing stock at 3 points in time: 1995, 2005, and 2015, so probably within all our lifetimes here. And what you can see is that the value of the housing stock has more than tripled in that time period, increasing from about £1.5 trillion in 1995 to nearly £6 trillion in 2015. The Office for National Statistics, which is the body which compiles these statistics, is very clear that the reason for this isn't that we've been building more houses and there's now lots more of them, it's because the price of the houses has increased dramatically. And this has been going on for decades, certainly before 1995. I'm sure those of you who have lived in Cambridge for a while will be acutely aware of this. If you bought perhaps a small flat or a house in, say, 1970, it might have cost you tens of thousands of pounds maximum, whereas today that would cost probably 300,000 or more, or even more than that. The price of a house has two different components. There's the price or value of the structure, the bricks and mortar, but there's also the value of the land that sits underneath. And actually what's often overlooked or not discussed much is that when the price of a house goes up, what's actually happening is the value of the land underneath is becoming more valuable, not the bricks and mortar that sit on top of it. This chart here shows the evolution of household net worth, net wealth, in the UK over the similar time period from 1995 onwards. And you can see that on paper at least, we've become a much wealthier country, increasing from about £3 trillion up to near enough £12 million. But if you look a bit closer, what you see is the main driver of that has actually been this dark blue block at the bottom here. And that's what's happened to the value of land in this country. You can see that it's quadrupled. And that's actually been the driving force behind the increase in the value of the housing stock that I showed on the previous chart, and also been the driver of the increase in household wealth in this country, because land has become much more valuable. And the question then is, well, why is this? Why is land now so valuable? Why is it that even in 2018, with smartphones, the internet, with space travel, why is it that land, something that's been around forever, why is it that that is now the most valuable asset in our economy? And there's a number of reasons for this. First of all, one reason is that land is just different to other goods and services. So land is essential for all activities, so we cannot live without it. You cannot work, live, eat, or sleep without being somewhere, without being in a set locational space. It's fixed in supply as well, unlike other man-made goods, so we can't build any more of it even if we wanted to. It's just there, and therefore you can naturally expect that as increased demand for land with population growth and economic growth interacts with something that's inherently fixed in supply, you might expect that the price of that will increase over time. And it's a famous quote from Mark Twain, who said, "Buy land, they're not making it anymore." And that kind of captures that in itself. But of course we know that some land is more valuable than others. So if you have an identical plot of land, or indeed an identical building in central London and in the East End of Glasgow, the one in the East End, one in central London will be worth probably hundreds of times that to the one in the East End of Glasgow. And that's because the value of land generally reflects what the amenities and the infrastructure that surround it. So new public or private investment in a new school, a new train station, or indeed a new private employer opening up nearby can dramatically increase the value of the land in that area. This was captured quite well by Winston Churchill in a famous speech in Parliament. He said, "Roads are made, streets are made, services are improved, electric light turns night into day, water is brought from the reservoirs 100 miles off in the mountains, and all the while the landlord sits still." And what Churchill was really getting at here is that the value of land doesn't reflect the efforts of the person that happens to own that bit of land. It's socially created. It reflects the activities of everyone in the local community, the local people, the local businesses, and indeed the government. And yet it is the landowner who often reaps a lot of the benefit of that development when the price of land increases and when they're able to charge higher rents in the rental market. Another factor why land has become so valuable is that there's quite a lot of evidence that as economies mature and as people get wealthier, the demand for space, for land, for real estate increases relative to other goods and services. So most goods and services, there's diminishing returns. You can only eat so many steaks, for example, before you get tired of them. But actually, as people get richer, they want more space. And they don't just want any space, they want real estate that's in the prime locations, and therefore people will stretch their incomes to get more real estate, to get more housing, to get more land in prime locations. land's a positional good and it reflects social status and therefore has different demand characteristics than other goods and services. But what I've just described so far are general features that can really be used to describe the land economy in different countries. But what makes the biggest difference, what determines the features of the land economy most decisively, is actually the history, the politics, the laws, the regulations of specific countries. And these vary dramatically between places, and they vary dramatically over time. And therefore, the rules of the game, if you like, are what really determine the dynamics of the land economy. And therefore, it's worth just briefly flying through a quick bit of history in this country to understand how things have changed, particularly over the past half century, to understand where we've got to today. So if we quickly rewind, say, to the beginning of the 20th century, we had a situation where most people lived in rented accommodation, often fairly horrible conditions, slum-like conditions, where poor health and poor social conditions prevailed. We then shifted into a period, partly a result of these health and social problems, but also because of world wars and soldiers returning from wars, where the government began to intervene significantly in the housing market, and it became viewed as a core function of government to provide affordable, quality housing for the population at a rate that people could afford. We then had a period after World War II, combined with the establishment of a formal planning system, where the government would play a leading role in the provision of housing and in the provision of purchasing land at existing use value and building new developments, including the new town developments, which I'll come on to speak about a bit more, combined with taxes on property and very restrictive financial regulation. This period really characterised where supply was fairly steady and actually did a reasonable job of keeping prices in check. Now that's kind of a quick generalisation, but that's a fair way of generalising it, I think. But this all really began to change in the 1970s, where we had a period where taxes on property began to be removed. We had the Schedule A income tax on property removed. When capital gains tax was introduced as a tax, there was an exemption made for primary residential properties, which instantly put housing at an advantage relative to other assets. We had a stream of subsidies introduced to encourage homeownership. So there's the mortgage interest relief at source, which was a significant subsidy towards homeownership. And significantly, we saw a dramatic change in the way that the government decided to intervene in housing and the housing market. And this was really happened with the dawn of Margaret Thatcher's time as Prime Minister. This chart here shows the number of new houses built by different types of tenure over time. You can see the blue shaded part of the chart is what was built in public sector local authorities. The yellow is what was built by private developers. And you can see that for much of the post-war period, there were significant amounts of housing built by the public sector. And this really dropped off a cliff in the 1980s. And this was a specific decision made by the government of the time to really pull back from government playing a role on the supply side of housing and instead shift the way that we fund housing or subsidise housing to the demand side. And what we do now is you probably all recognise housing benefit, which is we spend £25 billion a year giving money to individuals, subsidising individuals who can't afford rent, and we've left the kind of supply of housing really to the market. And this is quite a dramatic shift. This was then accelerated by the right to buy policy, which was introduced, which enabled council house owners to buy their property at a discount, which transferred a significant amount of stock, housing stock, from the public sector into the private sector, and often many of these weren't replaced. One of the most significant changes, though, came with reforms to the financial sector. So up until about the 1970s, if you wanted to buy a property, most people can't afford to buy a property with cash. Most people buy a property with borrowed money. That therefore means that the demand for housing is determined not just by how much income people have or how much savings people have. It's also determined by how much banks are able and willing to lend against that property. Up until the 1970s, most mortgage lending was done by building societies, which at the time were a small c conservative financial institutions run in the interests of members, there's quite strict regulations applied as well to mortgage lending. You had to save for quite a long time, you weren't allowed to borrow that much relative to your income, and it's quite tightly managed. There's a process of financial liberalisation began in the UK and other countries as well, the 1980s in particular, which really, first of all, eased the regulations around credit creation, mortgage credit creation, but also incentivised banks to become active players in the mortgage market, which previously they weren't really. And what this really did was unleashed a flood of new credit into the housing market. A flood of new credit available that people could borrow to invest in property. So the demand, if you like, the available demand for investing in property increased quite dramatically. And this triggered a shift in what the role of banks are in our economy. There's a kind of textbook role of banks as financial institutions is that they really lend against business for productive investment, and they might do a bit of mortgage lending on the side, but that's really what they do. And that used to be the case. But in recent decades, there's been a dramatic shift to the point where what banks mainly do today is really lend against real estate. So they are creating credit and lending it for the purchase of already existing assets rather than for investing in new production. And this chart here shows the allocation of UK bank lending by sector since the mid-1980s. And you can see that the two of the biggest chunks of that are the bright green, which is personal secured, which is mortgage lending, and the bright pink, which is commercial real estate, as increasing dramatically from where it was in the 1980s. You'll notice as well that the dark blue at the bottom is what you might call business lending, so lending for SMEs, so non-real estate, non-financial sector lending. You see that it's barely increased at all, and in fact today represents less than 10% of all bank lending. The UK isn't alone in this. This actually has happened across many advanced economies, particularly the Anglo-Saxon ones. This chart here shows on one axis house prices and on the other axis mortgage credit as a percentage of GDP across a selection of advanced economies. And you can see that mortgage credit in the red line increased from, if we look at about 1950, was about 10% of GDP, and that's increased dramatically to about 70% of GDP in more recent times. And you can see that that correlates very closely to what's happened to real house prices. The reason for that is what we define as land credit feedback cycle. So when you have an increased amount of credit flowing into a market like housing, which is characterised by relatively fixed supply, you have an inevitable increase in price. You have house price inflation. And you have a positive feedback loop emerging between mortgage lending, house prices, and the level of household debt. And you have this kind of reinforcing cycle going on. And I'll just pick out some highlights here, I won't go into too much detail, but it was really supported by various government policies which really incentivised this and really encouraged people to get on this train, but also enabled by various innovations in the financial sector which enabled much more mortgage lending to take place than would have otherwise, including things like securitization, which if any of you have seen the Big Short film was really sort of shone a light on that. And really among all the different things, and there's various other things that have happened in changes in planning, we've had a fall in interest rates across this period as well, which have all contributed. But certainly, in our view, the evidence shows that of all the things that have contributed towards the skyrocketing house prices, it's this, above all else, which has really been responsible for that. Now, all the changes I've just outlined weren't accidental. They weren't a kind of, just done without any specific intention. It was all really part of a specific strategy, which could be characterised as what's termed the property owning democracy. And this is an idea that was actually first really came to the fore in the 1950s in the Conservative Party, but really found its feet in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher. But the idea was that people should be able to own their own home. The idea being that what we want is a society, rather than people living in public housing or collectively shared provision of housing, giving people a stake in private property is desirable, and therefore we will introduce policies which will encourage that. And actually that was pretty successful for a while. This chart here shows the trends in tenure type in Britain over time from 1918, and you can see that there was a dramatic increase in levels of homeownership and owner occupancy here, right the way up to the early 2000s. And owner occupancy became the dominant, the most common form of tenure in about the 1970s. The side effect of all of these changes to encourage this, though, as I've outlined, was an explosion in house prices. And while easier access to mortgage credit and various subsidies papered over that for a while, eventually prices became so high that the tipping point was reached. Home ownership's actually been falling since the early 2000s, been falling quite dramatically. And actually, if you strip out the people who own outright and just look at mortgaged home ownership, it's actually been falling from the 1990s. And so the policy that we've had geared towards this ideology of the property owner democracy is actually failing on its own terms now, because home ownership is falling. These trends are much more dramatic in London, where a lot of the problems I've just outlined are more acute, if you like. It's all the problems I've outlined on steroids is in London. And this chart here shows some really interesting shifts in the pattern of tenure which have happened in recent years. Most notably, if you see here, the yellow line, the rise of the private rented market as a significant group of people in this country. In London, private rented is now the most popular form of tenancy. It's taken over owned with a mortgage just last year. And you can see social rent has been in consistent decline. And I think an interesting sort of question that arises out of this is the political economy dynamic, which is that if you've had a situation which we have for many decades where the majority of the electorate are homeowners, that has influenced politicians, that has shaped what they do, what policies they put out to appeal to voters. And there's been a tension between, on the one hand, addressing affordability issues for the minority who don't own property, and maintaining and even increasing the asset wealth of the majority of the electorate, for whom most of their wealth is tied up in housing. And I think that as we see these tenure changes shift, we start to see the shift in the electorate, and I think we're in a place now where we might start to see politicians have to listen to other interests apart from owner-occupiers. Now, one of the, I think, most important sort of effects of all of these changes, and it's been largely unspoken, I think, until recently, has been the effect of these changes on inequality, which is the key theme of the Imagine series. The rise in inequality has been, in recent decades, has been subject to quite a lot of debate by economists and policymakers in recent years. Lots of different explanations put forward around technology, globalization, and various other things. I think it's interesting to start from the point of looking at, well, where's the wealth actually being accumulated from? How has wealth been accumulated? If we're talking about wealth inequality, where's that wealth been accumulated from? And as I showed at the beginning, the vast majority of wealth that's been accumulated in the past 3 decades has come from the property market, it's come from house prices. And therefore, I think we need to look a bit deeper into that to understand the dynamics of rising inequality. If you've been one of the people who've benefited from rising house prices in recent decades, it's been great. A study from the Resolution Foundation showed that, on average, people who were born in the 1940s and 50s gained a windfall gain of £80,000 from rising house prices just between the mid-1990s and the 2000s. It also found that 17% of working age adults were earning more from their house than they were from their job in the early 2000s, just because of rising house prices. The Times reported late last year that in the last 3 months of 2017 alone, £850 million was converted from housing equity into cash using equity release products, predominantly by baby boomers, and that was predominantly used to fund holidays and new cars. So this has been great. For those who don't own property, though, it's been a slightly different story. The amount of income that private renters have spent on housing has increased from 10% in the 1980s to 36% today. If you're somebody on an average income trying to save to buy an average house, in the 1980s that took you on average 3 years, it now takes you on average 19 years. And this is where you see the dark side of this property ladder cycle that we've built up in this country start to emerge. And I think as a country we've yet to confront a truth about the property ladder, and that's that it's largely a zero-sum game. So while on the one hand, when land prices increase, if you're a property owner, it increases your net wealth, provides greater economic security, enables you to borrow more. And in fact, a lot of people have actually used housing equity to borrow more money to then perhaps buy a second or third home or enter the buy-to-let market. But for everyone else, it means higher rents in the rental market, it means having to save more for a deposit, and it means having less disposable income left over. And this shouldn't really be surprising, because when you think about it, when the price of land goes up, nothing new is being produced. It's just the increased price of a natural asset. That then has a cost that's borne by someone else at some point, meaning they have to pay more in order to buy it, or they're charged higher rents. And therefore I think that the trillions of pounds that have been accumulated through the property market in recent decades have come at the expense of current and future generations who don't own property. And I think this is something that really we haven't yet confronted yet, because we still see, even among economists who are as guilty as anyone else, viewing house price inflation as a kind of source of economic strength. You're going to celebrate it in the newspapers and house prices pick up, because it makes everyone feel good, or at least it makes the part of the population who generally turn out to vote feel good. And it makes everyone kind of feel good about themselves. And really I think that if we're going to get to grips with tackling inequality or taking inequality seriously, then we need to be looking at this much more closely. What does this mean? Well, I think it definitely makes us reassess the textbook description of how wealth is created and accumulated, which is, it's all through hard work and productive enterprise. This is a great article from the Daily Mash. I don't know if anyone knows the Daily Mash, the satire website. Who says, man whose house has gone up in value thinks he's a brilliant businessman. A man who's benefited from constantly rising property prices somehow believes it's due to his excellent business skills. This kind of captures quite well, I think, the key point, which is, really makes a mockery of the textbook model of how we think wealth is created and accumulated in this country. On a more serious note, I think this quote by John Stuart Mill is something I think modern economists would do very well to bear in mind. It says, if some of us grow rich in our sleep, where do we think this wealth is coming from? It doesn't materialise out of thin air, it doesn't come without costing someone, another human being. It comes from the fruits of others' labours which they don't receive. I think that's really what's been happening here with the wealth accumulated through rising house prices. And not only is this not particularly fair, it's actually not very efficient either. Having such high land and housing costs sucks up so much of our income and savings into what is fundamentally an unproductive part of the economy. It's mainly existing assets that we're trading between at ever-inflated prices. And therefore there's a very good argument to say, actually from a point of economic efficiency as well as social justice, that something really needs to be done about this. And what does need to be done then? Conscious that we really want to be getting onto the more positive vision side of things rather than dwell on the problems here. So the last part of the talk, I'm going to outline what I think at least is a beginnings of a vision for a more fair, affordable and sane housing market by 2027. I think the first overarching thing I just want to say before we go into the 5 separate things is that if I had to sum up in a sentence what I think should be, where we should be trying to get to, so we should be returning to a world where houses are viewed as simply somewhere to live, rather than vehicles for accumulating wealth, which is what they've partly become in this country. And it's also worth bearing in mind that this isn't the case everywhere, although it is the case in some countries. There are many countries actually where houses aren't viewed as vehicles for accumulating wealth, and I'll touch on that a bit more in a wee minute. So firstly, so what do we do? So first part of the vision is that uplifts in the value of land should be captured for public benefit, at least in part. If you think about the problem that I've outlined, it's a bit of a curious one, in the sense that at root, we've got an important asset, land, which has become very valuable. And we think about, well, why is that necessarily a problem? And the reason it's such a problem is that we've created a system, the rules of the game, if you like, which mean that some people benefit from that at the expense of others. So that diagram I showed earlier increases the wealth of some people while there's a cost borne by other people. But given that the value of land, as I outlined, is not the particular result of landowners' skill or effort, it's the result of the efforts of actually progress society as a whole, of the amenities, the infrastructure, economic growth, etc. Is it really fair the landowners should be able to gain, to basically accumulate that gain at the expense of others. And really, this has really been at the root of the land reform, part of the land reform debate for centuries, which is who should actually get that gain in the uplift in the value of land. And I think the pendulum swung far too far in the interests of land and property owners at the expense of everyone else. And therefore, I think we should be looking at mechanisms to ensure that some of the uplift in the value of land is captured for public benefit. And there's various different ways of doing this, various methods of land value capture. But significantly, I think part of the answer here is to do with reform of our taxation system. Today we have a world, a bizarre world, where the things that ideally we want more of, things like income, things like work, earning income, enterprise, are taxed much more heavily than windfall gains from land, which effectively aren't taxed at all. As I said, there's lots of exemptions in place. So I think we want to be swaying the pendulum to tax these unearned, what used to be called unearned income by the classical economists, people like Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, said that actually having a system where landowners get so much unearned wealth, they actually opposed that, not because they opposed capitalism, because they saw it as undermining the legitimacy of private property itself. And therefore, they advocated taxing these uplifts away and using them for public benefit. So I think that's one pillar of where we want to be trying to get to in 10 years' time. And maybe in the Q&A we can talk about, in a bit more detail, some of the different mechanisms which enable that. This just shows who actually gains from rising land prices at the moment from new housing development. When planning permission is granted, when new infrastructure is built, the value of land increases dramatically. And this is an estimate actually, and it shows here that this is the amount that accrues to landowners, whereas this is the amount, there's small amounts which do accrue to the public sector through Section 106 agreements and public land sales, but it's very small. So this is just to give you a sense of scale as to how far the pendulum swung. Second part of the vision, housing supply that's less dependent on volatile private market and land and homes. The private sector is very good at some things, as I'm sure we can all attest to our favourite goods and services. It's not very good at meeting housing need for everyone. If you look at evidence from across countries and indeed our own history, the only periods where we've done a reasonably good job at meeting housing need for everyone, not just for certain parts of the population, has been where the public sector has played an active leading role in that. Not necessarily monopolising it, but playing an active leading role in the provision of housing, and in particular in the provision of land. And I think the step away, the complete retreat from the role of the public sector in recent decades and leaving this to the whims of the market has had pretty damaging consequences. And that's not to say that private developers don't do well delivering some homes in some places, they do. But the very business model means that it makes it very difficult for them to actually meet the kind of housing need for everyone. Now, public housing, or even council housing as it used to be called, we seem to call it social housing now, but council has a very poor image in this country, and partly for good reason. And that's in part because lots of the stock that was in reasonable condition was the stock that was bought first in the right to buy. Also, the people who were in the best place to afford it were the ones who did it. What you have now is council housing is the worst stock that's left, and with people who have no other option, and therefore it has this poor image, which is partly justified. But I just want to show this image here. This is from Singapore. One thing about Singapore which is interesting is it's often held up by particularly people on the right as some kind of laissez-faire free market paradise. One thing people don't know about Singapore is that 90% of the land is publicly owned, and 85% of the population live in public housing. But it's not public housing like we know it. This is a new design that is being constructed. And I just show this to show that it's state of the art. You can read into it a bit more, but with lovely green space, with lovely amenities, swimming pool, shops, great transport. It's really just to illustrate the point that public housing doesn't need to be run-down, poor quality housing. It can be state of the art. And what I would argue is what we need now is similar to what we did at the beginning of the 20th century, when we moved from a world of people living in slums to living in council houses with a garden in the front, which was revolutionary, transformed lives. And now we need to do that again, but moving from our existing stock, which isn't particularly environmentally friendly, isn't particularly good quality, and moving to state-of-the-art housing for the 21st century. And I think we can learn a lot from Singapore in this regard. And indeed, I think part of that is about building new towns as well, which we haven't done at all since I think Milton Keynes was the last one. And again, making them fit for purpose for the lifestyles of the 21st century. Third sort of plank of this vision is a level playing field between tenures so that people aren't incentivised to over-invest in home ownership. I'm sure we've all had I'm sure most of us in this room, many people anyway, if faced with the choice, would rather own a home. But it's interesting to note that in many successful economies, Germany, Switzerland, most people don't own a home, and actually don't want to. But the reason for that is because the rental market is dramatically different. So in this country, we have basically the least secure rental market in Europe, whereby people are on 6-month contracts. If you're trying to raise a kid in a local school, having the knowledge you could get kicked out within 6 months isn't exactly the basis for long-term secure planning. So part of the solution here is to improve the option of the private rental market, to make it a more viable option. So if you want security, you don't necessarily need to buy a home. But level the playing field also means doing away with lots of the subsidies that we have for home ownership in place and putting it on a level playing field in terms of taxation. It makes an awful lot of sense to buy a home or even a second home, to plough money into property, partly because we make it so attractive. I think we need to close that down a little bit so that yes, if you want to buy a home, that's fine, but it's not because you think you're going to be able to make massive financial gain in it, it's because you just like to own a home and you want to live in it for normal reasons rather than financial gain. So I think there's a massive job to do about just levelling the playing field so that people can choose between, there's not a massive gap between different types of tenures in terms of security, but also in terms of how financially better off you'll be. Fourth part, and this is probably the trickiest one, is that no positive feedback cycle between the financial system, land values and the wider economy. As I said, I think this has been absolutely critical to the position that we've got ourselves in today. And this really means a bigger question, which is reconfiguring a financial system so that it's not ploughing so much money in towards property and land, which it is today, and instead having a financial system which supports investment, productive things in the real economy better. And this is partly to do with actually what are now international things like banking regulation and capital requirements, which do skew incentives towards property lending over other things. But it's also to do with the structure of our banking system that we have in this country, which is extremely concentrated, with a handful of large banks which have the same largely business model and behave in similar ways. In other countries, Germany being one example, you have a much more diverse banking system where you have, yes, the big banks who do the kind of things that your Barclays and HSBC do, but you have a thriving cooperative banking sector which is there to serve local needs and invest in the local economy. You have a local public banking sector, the Sparkassen, again, which is very much focused on building relationships with people in the local economy, lending to businesses, not necessarily just trying to invest in property. And again, we dedicate quite a bit of space in this area to the book, but I think it's absolutely vital that we try and see this as being critical to the housing debate, as well as the wider debate about what do we do about the financial system. And the fifth part is reduced reliance on housing as a means for accumulating wealth, paying for retirement, or funding care in old age. One of the reasons I think today that people actually do feel like they want to own a home, or that they do even want to buy second or third properties, in part is to do with thinking about the future, about making sure that they have are able to support themselves in old age, and for example not having to pay rent or having asset wealth there to pass on to generations, or indeed to use if they need it for whatever need in old age. And I think having a system whereby people view the property market as a way of being able to sustain themselves in old age is not a very efficient way of structuring our system. And I think we're having a much more secure and stable pension system, and also funding social care properly, and trying to de-link this link between property wealth and being able to sustain yourself in retirement is key. And obviously political challenges here. We all know what happened with Theresa May in the last election when she tried to link housing wealth to paying for social care. Raises all kinds of challenges, but I do think that, although I don't think the specific solution she had was the right one, it has all kinds of challenges, I think that it did look at some of the right questions at least, and I think this is key if we want to be taking that seriously. So I will end there. Thanks very much. I hope that's been reasonably interesting. If you want to find out more, this was a book we published last year, Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing. I think we've got some copies here, and happy to chat after and answer any questions.